This Sadler Stories video is a little bit different than some of the others that I've done in the past on a few different counts. You notice that I've let my hair down and I'm dressed a little bit more casually than I usually go, in one of my favorite band shirts of one of my favorite bands. And I'm going to be talking about something that has run as a course throughout my life, really from my childhood years, I would say from 6 or 7 years old all the way up to the present. And it connects with things that I've done video-wise that you might be aware of or you might not. Also writings that I have out there. So I'm talking about heavy metal music, and specifically in the 1970s and the 1980s, which became an integral part of my life. I won't say that I built my entire personality around it, but it was a really central part of my identity. I viewed myself by the 1980s as a metalhead, and at a certain point I kind of left that behind in a way that I'll tell you about in a bit, but I grabbed it back in my 30s and have continued on with that well into my now 50s. So I should start at the beginning. Now, I was born the same year as heavy metal, and heavy metal didn't just begin with Black Sabbath. There were other bands that were also centrally important: Deep Purple, Uriah Heep, UFO. There were others that were kind of in the background that didn't get quite as much prominence, but show you that there was something cool going on. All these bands brought out albums in 1970. Lucifer's Friend in Germany, Sir Lord Baltimore in the United States, and then throughout the early 70s, so many other bands joined the picture. But heavy metal wasn't quite a clear genre. People would talk about heavy rock or the heaviness of things, or they would talk about hard rock, right? And there's a lot of overlap and interconnection. And now I was born in 1970, and by the time that I was listening to the radio along with my friends or checking out records that they had or getting records of my own, there were quite a few bands that would later be identified as heavy metal that I was getting into. One of these was Kiss. That was probably the biggest band for all of us, in part because they had the makeup and, great music to listen to. One of my friends actually had Kiss Alive, and we'd go up in his room, Jeff Van Meter, me and him and Jay, and we'd listen to this, and we'd read through all the album notes, and we'd go over to my house, and we'd get the crayons out, and, I would draw Ace Frehley, and they would draw Peter Criss or Gene Simmons or Paul Stanley, and we'd all talk about who our favorite member of Kiss was. I actually even had a Kiss lunchbox at one time. But there were other bands that you could hear out there on the radio that were making an impact as well. Or sometimes you'd have a friend whose older brother or sister got into that. So in elementary school, I was already hearing a good bit of heavy metal. There was AC/DC on the airwaves with TNT. That just fascinated us, right? Some people say AC/DC isn't heavy metal, but they certainly were part of that spectrum. And we would hear other stuff as well. I mean, Led Zeppelin has some pretty heavy songs that made it onto the radio. The Scorpions in the 70s as well. And we could go on and on. And so I was hearing this stuff and responding to it without really knowing what to call it. And there were other bands that were, similarly doing hard or heavy stuff that we don't actually consider to be metal. And it was all kind of mixed together. And in the 1980s, for me, that started to coalesce in a way that helped me figure out what I was actually interested in listening to. And, so by the time that I was in middle school, there were, Van Halen, we would hear them, and 1984 had come out, and there's going to be a story about that, but there was also Def Leppard. I had the Pyromania tape. So I'm hearing this stuff on the radio, getting my hands on tapes that I play in my boombox or on my little cassette recorder, listening to the radio, hearing cool stuff out there, and my friends would also be doing this. And so Van Halen's 1984 was a really important album for me, in part because it would lead me to what was to become my absolute favorite band, really from 1984 well into my early 20s. That's Iron Maiden. Now, you might say, well, how the hell did Van Halen lead you to Iron Maiden? So this friend of mine in 8th grade, Walter Clothier, he was a metalhead. And I didn't know that at the time. And he told me that he would make a recording of 1984 because he had the album at home. And I was like, cool. So I gave him a 45-minute cassette tape. That was what we would use back then, because usually albums would be shorter than 45 minutes. If they were longer, you could put something on the other side. But usually it would be a bit shorter. And there was enough room that he was like, well, let's add something else in there. So what did he put? A song that perhaps is, among dozens of amazing songs that they have put out, perhaps their best. Iron Maiden's The Trooper. And so I'm listening to 1984, which is a great album, by the way. Sometimes people are like, oh, it's not as good as the previous Van Halen albums. It's different, but it's good. And some of the songs on there, like House of Pain, they were doing years and years before it ever got recorded on 1984. But Iron Maiden's The Trooper was like taking it up to not a higher level, like 3 levels up from Van Halen's 1984. I heard it, and something in me, the very first few bars, began responding to it. I remember exactly where I was. I was listening to it in a park, sitting on a bench in Waukesha, playing it on my boombox, and I heard this, and I was like, what is this? So I went to Walter afterwards. He gave it to me on a Friday. I saw him the next Monday, and I was like, what is this song that you put at the end of the Van Halen stuff? And he said, oh, that's Iron Maiden. You like them? I mean, I can get you some more of their stuff if you want to. And I was like, yeah. And I gave him the tape back, and he put Iron Maiden's Peace of Mind on the other side. This is before I bought the album, which I did shortly as well. And I listened to this, and I was like, holy crap, this is what I've been looking for my entire life without even knowing it, right? So this, and Walter was also helpful. He's like, this is heavy metal, man, and people were talking about it at the time. It was becoming a major force within the music industry. And so that was the end of my 8th grade, moving into freshman year of high school. Over that summer, I not only got my hands on Iron Maiden's Peace of Mind and Number of the Beast, I also started hearing other things on the radio. I heard Ratt's Round and Round. I remember exactly where I was when that was playing. We were getting off the expressway, I-94, I think into Brookfield, on an off-ramp with all those, lights, those street lights that shone orange at the time. And this came on, and I was like, holy crap, what is this? So there was all these cool things. I got my hands on Ratt. I got Motley Crue's Shout at the Devil. I started buying Circus and Hit Parader so I could learn more about this music. I started listening even more to the radio, particularly to WQFM, which wasn't a metal station as such, but a hard rock station. But they were playing more and more metal. And so joining the Columbia Record Club, I got, Ratt, Motley Crue, I got Twisted Sister, I got Black Sabbath's Born Again, I got Judas Priest, Defender of the Faith. I got Crocus's The Blitz. What else did I get? Sammy Hagar, VOA, I think it was. And there were a number of other albums, and I can't quite remember all of the ones that I got at that time, but there were quite a few. And including a misstep, Molly Hatchet. I forget which one it was. It's the one with the guy on the horse with the axe. Molly Hatchet turned out to be Southern rock rather than heavy metal, but they look pretty metal, you know. So that's all happening in the summer. And I'm also like, you know, buying tapes, learning about these, finding out about bands that I didn't know about, or I knew about, but I didn't know that they were part of this. You know, I go on camping trips with these other kids and Parents Without Partners that I've talked about in other videos, and they're playing Masters of Metal as we're going around and drinking stolen brandy and slow gin that my friend Jerry had taken from his dad's stuff. And, you know, we're hearing Y&T and hearing Rainbow and Dio and more new Kiss and Iron Maiden and all these other cool bands on this compilation that we played over and over and over again. So I come to school and, you know, I've started to grow out my hair. I'm starting to dress a little bit more metal. You know, eventually at Christmas time, I'll get like a studded bracelet that I'll wear. Craving leather, craving denim, you know, and I find other people who are as equally into this as me, and they start turning me on to more and more bands. This friend of mine, Chris Whittam, who actually turned out to be kind of a bad guy. There's a whole story I could tell about him. He was so important because he would lend me tapes. He'd be like, oh, man, you got to hear these guys. You like Motley Crue and Ratt? How about some Wasp? Check this stuff out. Oh, you like that? Here's some Motorhead. Check these guys out. Here's Raven. They're a band that not a lot of people know about. Here's some Saxon. And he was just like constantly, generously either taping stuff for me or just giving me a tape and saying, go ahead and dub it and bring it back to me. And, you know, there was that going on. I also started going to record stores. I bought Dio's Holy Diver that like in the first week of school in Waukesha. My mom wasn't thrilled with me bringing that home, but I was like developing this taste for metal. And then there were other people who were like, oh man, you got to hear this new band, Metallica. They are really something. And then learning about Metallica meant learning about Megadeth. So I'm hearing early thrash. There's Accept. There's all these different bands that are now becoming part of a cosmos. And, you know, on my spring break in Florida, I bought 2 tapes at Walmart in the bargain rack. I got Judas Priest, Sin After Sin, and Black Sabbath's We Sold Our Souls for Rock and Roll. And I was, you know, kind of puzzled because I was like, man, Judas Priest sounds very different in this than they do in Defenders of the Faith, because their sound had evolved over those, so 1983, 77 maybe, 78, you know, things had changed over that period. And I was getting more and more and more into it, and having friends who were equally into it, and, you know, doing the silly things like writing these band logos on my notebooks, on my jeans, and, you know, geeking out with other people about this music that I'm responding to. And I got in with a bunch of other kids, mostly older kids, you know, and we'd go to concerts and thrash out, you know, do the headbanging and all that sort of stuff. I had a great time with that. And that continued on well into my, you know, the end of my teens and my 20s. I listened to heavy metal a lot when I was in the Army. After I got out, I started to branch out into other music, but there were new bands on the scene, like, you know, or new to me rather, like Queensryche. You know, I heard Operation Mindcrime, and I was like, holy crap, this is amazing. And then I started listening to their older catalog, you know, and then by the time I was in college, they came out with Empire. Meanwhile, all these other bands like Judas Priest and Iron Maiden and, you know, Metallica were bringing out new stuff constantly. well, not constantly, but in kind of a sequence. Same thing with Motorhead, same thing with Dio, and I was, Scorpions too. I was finding all of this music that I responded to. And my musical taste did widen and change a bit, in part through the influence of a friend of mine, Marco, who gave me tapes full of all sorts of other things, including a lot of punk and post-punk and alternative. The Violent Femmes were here in Milwaukee. They were a massive influence. You couldn't, not listen to the Violent Femmes, and they weren't metal, but they were cool too. And, then in the middle of my college time, grunge suddenly became big here in the Midwest. I know it was bigger out there in Seattle and stuff, but we're always a little bit behind. And grunge kind of took the wind out of the sails on some of the metal stuff that was going on. And I think in some ways it occupied a similar sonic space. You have, heaviness to it. Think about, Stone Temple Pilots or Nirvana, or even, there were metal bands. Alice in Chains is both grunge and metal. And you did have some other metal bands that were doing cool things, like Prong with weird time signatures. I had, by the way, at that time gotten into playing bass. I learned to play bass in the Army, and after I got out with my first paycheck, I bought myself a cheap Aria Pro 2 bass. Betsy Blue is her name, and a practice amp, and then eventually I'd buy myself a 200-watt power amp with a 15-inch speaker so I could, play some cool stuff. And I did play in a few bands, and I'd cover a lot of metal stuff, I learned a lot of Black Sabbath songs, a lot of Metallica songs, a lot of Iron Maiden songs, a lot of Judas Priest songs, quite a few things, and people would want me to play with them, right? But I also played a lot of Pearl Jam and Nirvana and things like that when I was in college too. And so, I was listening to a wider range of things, and I wouldn't say that I ever stopped listening to metal entirely, but it had become, at least the 1980s and 1970s stuff, it had become secondary to other things that I was listening to by the time that I was in graduate school in the mid to late 90s and the early 2000s. And then with my family, we moved into a house on my family's land that I purchased with my inheritance after my mother had died. And I was watching a cable show on VH1, and it was this 4-part series about heavy metal. So this would be like maybe 2003 or so. And I always found these kind of biopics interesting, and they're playing the music. And I'm listening to this, and I was like, man, that stuff was really good. Why did I ever stop listening to it or not listen to it quite so much? What was going on? And I was like, I need to start listening to this stuff again. And I actually had quite a few CDs of metal bands that I had held on to, and I put them on my computer, and then I talked to my cousin who had a huge collection himself, and my sister came into town one time, and she had a whole bunch of stuff, and I put all that on my computer. And then I would go to used CD stores, and just as I'd frequented used record stores buying stuff in the 80s, used CD stores in the 90s and 2000s were kind of a place to go. And I started buying more and more stuff, and I bought things that I'd never had before and putting them into compilations that I would listen to as I was driving. And it was around that time that I got my oldest kid, at that time my only kid, Kat, into not just heavy metal, but specifically Kiss, the hottest band in the world. She knew by the time that she was like 2 or 3, I could say, who's the hottest band in the world? She'd say, Kiss! And she would ask me to play the songs for her. She also loved, songs like Godzilla by Blue Oyster Cult. She really got into UFO, interestingly, and loves them to this day. Which is kind of a cool thing because lots of people are into, wearing the shirts for Iron Maiden or Metallica or Kiss. not that many people know about UFO and say, are they going to play, Lights Out or Doctor Doctor at this thing? Michael Schechner Group came to town, and I got to see them with my wife, and I recorded some of the stuff and sent them off to Kat, because Kat loves those songs so much. So anyway, that continued on, and I was really, really fortunate in that my second wife, my real wife, let's call her, because I had my first marriage annulled, loves heavy metal as much as I do. And so we've gone to, must be dozens and dozens of concerts together over the 12 years that we've been married. We've seen so many bands. I've also seen some with Kat, too. This last year at Summerfest, we got to see Queensryche together, and we saw Autograph, the end of their act, and it was pretty good. They're not so much a metal band, but they're known for Turn Up the Radio. And we saw Vixen, a band that in the 1980s, it was an all-woman band, and they weren't that great, but the people that they have in the band now are amazing. So it's a great time, and I get to share it with people that I care about. I've also got friends who are super into it. Scott Terulli, for example, with whom I do the classic metal class, which we're going to start up again in November. We've both been rather busy, but we managed to get over 20 different sessions in on that in the past. I write Heavy Metal Philosopher. I've got other friends who I've made over the years who are equally into metal, and specifically the stuff from the 70s and 80s, and those bands continuing on through the 90s and 2000s. And I found some newer bands who I really love as well, typically sounding kind of like the older stuff, like Orchid. Wonderful band, sounds a lot like, they make the songs Black Sabbath never got around to making. Many others that I could bring up as well. So this is something that is really valuable to me. I don't think any day goes by without me listening to some music, at least. I play some of it myself as well on my handy dandy banjo. I mean, you might say that's not very metal, but I can do Scorpions and Black Sabbath and Iron Maiden and Judas Priest and Motorhead and other bands on the banjo. Sounding good enough. Accept as well is another big one for me. So I thought I would share this with you. There isn't really any grand closure to this, because I imagine I'll probably, along with my wife, be going to concerts, listening to this sort of stuff. When the bands die off and stop playing, we'll go to tribute bands, and we'll continue listening to it and loving it throughout the rest of my existence. And I'll close with this. I've been putting together a list of the songs that I would most like to have played at my memorial service after I die. I'll give you a few of them. We'll Burn the Sky by the Scorpions, Zero the Hero by Black Sabbath, maybe The Trooper. We'll see. I'm going to put together an entire list, and then we'll see if my wife outlives me and plays them, or perhaps it'll be my oldest child, Kat, doing it, since they like heavy metal so much. But that is the whole story. I don't know if you're into that kind of music, but if you are, you kind of know what I'm talking about here. And if you're not, maybe you want to see whether you would enjoy listening to some of these great bands from the 1970s and 1980s that made such a huge stamp with their wonderful music, the heaviness, the hardness, the lyrics, the beauty, the brutality, all of these things combined.